Between 1942 and 1952, Indigenous children in Canadian residential schools were deliberately underfed. Not due to a lack of resources, Canada had plenty. By scientific choice. Government-funded researchers needed control groups for their nutritional experiments. Those control groups were already malnourished children who were deliberately denied vitamin supplements to measure the effects of deprivation. It's not a theory. It's in federal archives. And it wasn't revealed until 60 years after the fact. Canadian Indigenous residential schools operated from 1883 to 1996. At their peak, they housed tens of thousands of children ripped away from their families, most of whom were underfed, poorly housed, and subjected to inadequate sanitary conditions. The federal government and churches that ran these institutions knew it. Internal reports documented it as early as the 1900s. It was within this context that, during World War II, a group of Canadian researchers decided that residential schools offered a unique opportunity, a captive population already vulnerable, upon which longitudinal nutritional studies could be conducted. The subjects were not informed of their participation. Their parents were not consulted. Consent in this context was a non-existent notion. For decades, these experiments did not exist in the official version of Canadian history. The residential schools themselves were only officially recognized as a system of forced assimilation in 2008, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued an apology on behalf of the Government of Canada. The 2008 apology acknowledged physical, sexual, and psychological abuses. It did not mention nutritional experiments, because these had not yet been publicly revealed. It was only in 2013 that historian Ian Mosby published his article Administering Colonial Science in Social History Journal, revealing what had happened in residential schools in British Columbia, Ontario, and Manitoba between 1942 and 1952. Ian Mosby wasn't a whistleblower. He was a historian doing his job, searching federal archives for documents on Canadian wartime nutrition policy. What he found was in the records of Library and Archives Canada, accessible, inventoried, simply never examined from that angle before. The documents describe projects overseen by researchers whose names are known: Frederick Tisdall, co-inventor of cereal Pablum, a Canadian nutritional icon; Percy Moore, director of federal government health services for Indigenous peoples. One of the men who decided Indigenous nutrition policies simultaneously directed experiments using them as study subjects. One of the most troubling aspects of the documents: some experiments were designed in a way to deliberately worsen the existing state of malnutrition. At Norway House Residential School in Manitoba, control group members were denied vitamin supplements while the experimental group received them to measure the difference. Children already deprived were kept in that state for the sake of study. The primary documents are housed in several federal archives. Tisdall and Moore's research reports are partially published in medical journals of the time, meaning Canadian medical community had access to this information and did not react. Department of Indian Affairs archives contain correspondence regarding funding and supervision of these projects. What the documents clearly show: these projects received approval and funding from the federal government. They were not the acts of individuals acting outside the system, they were the system, functioning normally, using human resources that residential school policy had put at its disposal. The conclusions published by these researchers in medical journals of the 1940s and 1950s never mention the context of residential schools, the non-consented nature of experiments, or living conditions of subjects. These children appear in scientific literature as data points, not as people. What federal archives of that period reveal, when read together, is a coherent system, not a series of accidents or individual excesses. The residential school policy created a captive population. Health policy used that population for its own scientific needs. The same government officials oversaw both aspects. The same federal funds made them possible. Nutritional experiments are not an anomaly in the history of Canadian residential schools. They are its logical extension into the realm of science, the same conviction that Indigenous peoples could be used to be civilized, to be assimilated, to be studied, without their consent or humanity being a pertinent constraint. This is not a distant past story. The last residential schools closed in 1996. Living direct witnesses still exist. Children who survived these experiments had their own children, their own grandchildren. When Mosby's revelations were published in 2013, the federal government responded characteristically: minimum recognition, no formal responsibility. The then Minister of Health called the experiments horrific and said they should never have happened. No specific commission of inquiry was mandated. No prosecution was possible, the main culprits were dead. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission included nutritional experiments among the many forms of documented abuse in residential schools in its 2015 final report. It formulated 94 calls to action. The Government of Canada agreed to implement them. Their implementation is partial and slow. Federal archives on residential schools continue to be examined. Researchers and residential school survivors continue to file ATI requests to access still partially classified documents. Indigenous Canadian children were deliberately underfed by scientists funded by the federal government. These facts were in the archives for 60 years when a historian finally shone light upon them. Nobody had looked before. Or rather, nobody had wanted to look. What Canadian archives contain further about Indigenous peoples in still partially classified funds, in non-examined files, is a question Canada has not yet fully answered. Subscribe to not miss the next episode.